So I have a 73 magazine from October 1962, and this has got a wonderful article. Of course, by this time, the Junkbox is already a very mature type of situation, since the surplus equipment from World War II has hit big time, and hams have been collecting parts for years. And the name of the article is How to Scrounge a Deluxe Junkbox. Boy, did I learn a lot from this article. Let me just read the first paragraph. Amateur radio operators delight in showing off their junk boxes. Practically every author mentions that his homebrew gizmo can be built with Junkbox parts for little or no cash outlay. But how are these parts accumulated? So I wanted to go through my Junkbox. Before we start into the whole concept of a junk box, let's talk about a comment that I got from a guy who said that, solid state projects are simply less expensive, and the parts are less expensive than trying to deal with this old tube stuff. Why do we even bother with the tube type projects, with the antique projects? And that's a great question. There's no doubt. Solid state projects, solid state kits, solid state components, mass produced, more modern, readily available. You can get new parts, and trying to find this old stuff is getting tougher and tougher. No doubt about it. However, just because something is old and obsolete doesn't mean it's impossible to build a collection of junk that's going to allow you to do some of these projects. And some of the oldest things that we collect have the least value. I'll give you an example. Roman coins. So many Roman coins were minted that they actually have a fairly low value compared to, let's say, modern American coins, which are very collectible. So we found out that not too many people are designing with tubes anymore. There's not too much equipment out there that uses tubes anymore, and they were made in the millions. So we now have this glut of tubes. We have more valves available than we have people that actually will ever use them up. So it's not outlandish to continue to build tube circuits well into the 21st and 22nd centuries. Also, if a valve or tube becomes popular, as with the audiophiles and hi-fi, the resurgence of analog and hi-fi tube audio, those tubes will stay in manufacture, and they are being manufactured. So it is practical to try to collect this stuff and to build your own junk box. Let's find out why we need the junk box first, and we'll go through the cost, the real cost of projects. Parts are expensive. You start to fill out a bill of material and go online, order the parts, mail order online from some of the larger parts houses such as DigiKey, Mauser, some of the old-time antique radio type suppliers. And pretty soon you find out that the project costs a lot more than you thought it was going to cost. Even the simplest old-time circuit can take some pretty specialized parts. And it is true that solid state circuits, especially integrated circuit based and simple 1, 2, 3, 4 transistor based, are much lower cost. But if you want to make old time circuits like this 2-tube transmitter, this is a 6AG7 driving a 6L6 for a 35 watt type CW transmitter. You want to build something like that, or maybe a hi-fi amplifier or a guitar amp. You're going to have a junk box that can support that type of project, or you're going to end up spending a lot of money. So I just wanted to give you an example of some real costs based on investigating parts lists of some common projects. We'll do Crystal Radio, the Morgan Regen, the Paraset, that's a very popular project. this transmitter, this is a 6AG7 6L6 type transmitter. Maybe we'll do a simple power supply for tube type circuits, and I think that that's enough to give you a sense for how much these projects can really cost. Maybe we'll do a simple guitar amp too, like a 6V6. But take a look at these parts lists and take a look at these real costs and see if this is something that you would like to lower that part cost a little bit so you can build some of these projects. That's what having a very good junk box is all about. It's about taking a big bite out of that bill of material parts cost. This stuff is getting expensive, and even if you do the kids type crystal radio project, you find that what's supposed to be something that you can use from household items, by the time you pick up all of the parts, you know, the earphone, or is it a expensive magnetic headset, by the time you put it all together, wow, that's more than I wanted to spend on this little kids project for the Scouts. How about a power supply? Well, now you're immediately into a transformer. You've got to get a choke. There's different parts in the power supply that are readily available and inexpensive, and some parts like the magnetics that you're going to spend a lot on. But if you want to power your command set, you want to power your small transmitter or regen receiver, you're going to need a decent power supply. So this supply is useful for both of those. And then the Morgan book, you know, the parts to reproduce his simple regen receiver, quite a popular project. But you find out you got to get plug-in coil forms and sockets, and you need a variable capacitor, and boy, it sure would be nice to find a nice vernier dial to go on the front so the thing looked great. It all begins to add up once you start to look for these parts. And don't think the parts are magically going to show up online. Sometimes it's going to take you the better part of a year to collect all the parts you need for a simple transmitter or receiver. Even if you think the parts are out there, you might have to wait a long time before you find that one last part you need to complete that transmitter. Look at the prices, $500 for a transmitter. What are you, crazy? And of course the Paraset. Wow, I want to build one of those. Would somebody just make a kit that I could buy for $29? I don't think so. I think you're going to be collecting a jack and paying $29. Look at the price on this one, and I don't even think this is a complete list. How about a guitar amp? I built a couple of these, some with push-pull, some with single-ended. Even a single-ended that's based on such a primitive circuit as the old Fender Champ. You're going to find that you need a power transformer, an output transformer, and the cost of these parts. Well, you better get some nice Black Beauty capacitors because it's got to sound right. Hey Mike, that's a nice looking junk box you got there. What are the kinds of things that you've been able to collect? Well, here's a box. It's got nothing but potentiometers in it. Volume controls have been taken off old radios. That's the kind of thing that you should just put in a box because you never know when you're going to need a potentiometer. Here's a box that contains nothing but power resistors. You know, whenever you see a power resistor, pick it up, throw it in the box because you don't know you're going to need a bleeder or a voltage divider. Power resistors. Here's a box with nothing in it but fuse holders and lamps. Of course, if you're looking at swap meets, radio meets, you're going to Hamfests and looking under the tables, you're going to see boxes that contain things like this. These are surplus modules, unfinished ham radio projects. These are a wealth of parts to remove and recycle. You're going to find some old chassis. chassis for your projects. What's in here? Oh, a bunch of resistors. Here's a bunch of half-watt and 1-watt resistors. You know, these resistors probably have moved in value over the years. So make sure you measure them with your ohm meter. Sometimes, for instance, a 1K resistor might go up a couple hundred ohms over the years. So make sure that the resistors, especially these old carbon composition resistors, haven't drifted a little bit. Ah, some orange drop capacitors. Wonder where I got those. Some rarities. Here's some plug-in coil forms. Here's an old aircraft microphone, carbon mic. Anytime you see vernier dials, pick them up. They may look dirty. They need a little bit of work to make them operate again, but these are going to look really sharp in your old projects. Well, here's another half-finished or unfinished ham project. Looks like it was some type of converter. Lots of good parts there. Meters, always good to save meters when you find them. When you're tearing apart AM radios, you're going to be able to get IF transformers and audio output transformers from those old radio chassis. Here's a vibrator. No, not that kind of vibrator, guys. This is the kind of vibrator that makes high voltage from the battery, like 6 volts or 12 volts or 24 volts. Connectors, other types of coils, old tubes. Hold on to the tubes. We love these variable capacitors, so whenever you're taking a radio chassis apart, be sure to save the variable. Like the binding posts on old plate. Tube sockets. Tube sockets of all kinds. Terminal strips. These are all great Junkbox parts. Here's some tube shields. Knobs. Some of them look a little funny, like this knob must have come off some low-cost stereo from the 70s. That knob could be used. We can recycle that. Rotary switches. Oh, those old TV sets from the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, and a lot of antique test equipment are going to contain fine power transformers. These transformers, cut them out and reuse them. These are the whole secret to making tube-type projects, is getting a good transformer. So that's a beautiful find right there. So we're down to the bottom of our junk box. We've got some capacitors that we pulled out of things. We've got some terminal strips and tube sockets. But, oh, and here's a piece of ferrite. Ferrite rod antennas. Ferrite out of old radios. So you get the idea. The junk box is made from things that you find under the table at Hamfest, at radio swap meets. You find them at the dump because a lot of times people throw away these old radios, these old chassis, and they'll allow you to pick the dump and maybe the metal pile and take that home, and you can remove parts from it. You can also find some of these parts at your neighbor's yard sale. Yard sales have some fine old tube-type electronics from the 40s, 50s, and 60s just laying there for a couple bucks or $5. You can get yourself a nice chassis to tear apart, and you can build your own junk box. Let's take a closer look at some of these modules and half-finished ham projects, obsolete ham stuff that you find at underneath the tables and benches at a typical ham fest. Here's a module that came out of a military or high commercial type, probably a receiver because it's got some trimmer capacitors here. These are nice 25 puff variable capacitors. Looks like there's some fancy tunable coils here, and a rotary switch and some mica capacitors. Plus a nice little project box potentially. Looking a little closer at this, this is some type of converter project. Looks like it had an SO239 that I've stripped off already, which is a connector for coax. A couple more here. This could have been some kind of a converter, or perhaps it was some type of preamplifier, but there's some air ducts type coil stock in here. There's a nice 2.5 millihenry choke still hanging in there. Those are getting harder to find. So here's another one that's already been pretty much stripped out, but it's got some nice tube sockets still on it, and a couple of trimmers again. Some old resistors. Here's a BNC connector. This is some type of military radar module. It says IF preamplifier. It's got 3 6AK5 tubes, and they've got these nice bayonet tube covers on them. You find the tubes, put them in the bag, test them, reuse them. This has got some variable coils and probably all kinds of goodies inside. This one hasn't even been opened. This is a project I did for another video. It's a Q multiplier. So it's got a triode tube and a variable capacitor. So there's a little Q multiplier project. You'll find stuff like that. What was this? This is a school type intercom system, like a little power amp for your school system, so we can call you to the principal's office, for instance. Looks like the transformer's already been removed from this, the tubes. There's another transformer that's gone, probably an audio output transformer. There's still a few parts left on there, but this one's already been pretty much stripped. So that just gives you an idea of the easy stuff to throw in a backpack when you're wandering around, and take these home, and these become the basis for building your junk box. I have a candidate chassis that represents a chassis that you might find at your neighbor's garage sale or yard sale. This particular one is not going to get parted out because it was just loaned to me. Actually, the radio collector was interested in the case and did not want the chassis. But I'm still a little nervous about taking something like this apart. But you can see that a typical radio chassis, like this AM/FM mono Zenith, is going to contain quite a few tubes. They're all miniatures. A very nice variable capacitor, which we can use for our crystal radio or our super heterodyne or regenerative receiver projects. It's got several IF transformers, and they're well marked in this one. These are the 455 kilohertz transformers. It's got basically it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 455 and 2 10.7 megahertz transformers. So this is a wealth of IF transformers in this Zenith. There's a nice audio output transformer that we can use. Looks like whoever had this last bypassed across the selenium rectifier with a 1N4007 diode. That's kind of a trick that people do to bring back the power. So I would expect maybe he recapped it too in the bottom. Let's take a look. Yeah, you can see that here's the new capacitors. So the power supply has been redone in this receiver. Here's the some of the front end coils. These are probably actually the oscillator coils here. Maybe the input coil to the FM. This might be the FM front end here. Not too many useful parts down under here. We see some half-watt resistors. We see some ceramic disc capacitors. There's a band switch here. But if you were building a project that, for instance, needed tube sockets, needed a variable capacitor, needed an audio output transformer, you could get it off this chassis. So this is an example of a commercial type radio receiver. This one looks like it's early 60s vintage, maybe late 50s, who knows. And you could get quite a few useful parts off this. Now, this is an AC-DC set. It does not have a transformer. The more desirable chassis have some power transformers on them that you can use. And the receiver type power transformers are the right size for receiver projects, obviously. Sometimes they're large enough for up to 10 or 15 watt transmitter projects as well. So keep your eyes out for transformers. Okay, now we're talking about a mother lode of parts. This particular piece was picked up at a radio swap meet last winter for $5. It is a pan adapter, and it looks like it's been modified to handle 27 to 30 megahertz. So somebody modified this thing to be a pan adapter for the CB or the ham band, or perhaps knowing who modified this, because I can see some hen scratch on the side of this, and it says K4GGY, modified in 1972. Now I know who that ham is. He was a very famous VHF, UHF experimenter. So he modified this from 27 to 30 megahertz so that he could observe the IF of some high-frequency receiver he was developing. So this could be a historical piece, who knows? A very famous ham modified this. The pan adapter itself, what it does is it looks at your IF and presents it on a vacuum tube that's a CRT, cathode ray tube, and it can tell you if there are stations in the passband. So when you're looking for something like a digital signal or to see who's in the band, this would give you that pan adapter view. Of course, today with our software-defined receivers, our little laptop PC with a dongle SDR will give you the same display. But in the old days, it took all of this electronics. So this thing is never really going to be used again. Look at all the parts. Beautiful fuse holders, knobs. Let's tip it up. And it has these rails, so we can tip it right on its top. Look at the parts. A giant transformer with all of the right voltages for almost any transmitter project. A nice choke. Smaller transformers. Octal tubes with sockets. We've got, looks like we've got some big oil-filled capacitors here that really seldom go bad. Let's turn it around. Look at all of those beautiful parts. Nice half-watt and 1-watt resistors, some 2-watt resistors, military-grade potentiometers, power resistor, and so on. So it's not often you find a piece like this, but this is fair game. Look at that SO239 antenna connector. Fair game for parting. And this is how you score a very toasty junk box. It's only fair that we give equal time to the solid state junk box. Now, solid state, starting with the era of germanium transistors and pocket radios and portable radios from the 50s and early 60s, and you can get some cool little miniature variable capacitors, something like this. See, it's got the AM broadcast band on there. You know, you can get you know, some antennas off those radios. And we get into the, you know, the project box era, where the project boxes begin to get smaller, specifically for solid-state projects. And you start to get the smaller crystals. You know, these were started out to be low-cost soldering crystals for TV sets in the 70s, and then they went down to these smaller crystals. And we get into the age of the walkie-talkies, and this is a family radio type walkie from the late 90s, early 2000s. The computer revolution comes, and now you start to see boxes for switching. This is a parallel port box, an old surplus one. This is a nice little project box. Also in the computer era, we start to get all kinds of power supplies, and these have all kinds of useful parts on them. These have been picked over already for their high voltage capacitors. There's some high voltage transistors, field effect transistors. There's even some pulse width modulation chips on some of these that are useful for projects. So lots of good diodes and parts on these old ATX and pre-AT type power supplies. The wireless revolution comes along and we start to see, different types of Wi-Fi and wireless Part 15 devices that, you can send video through the air. You can strip some parts off these. And of course, this is the age of the wall wart, where we have all kinds of transformers that plug into the wall. They convert it to DC. These are very useful for powering your solid-state projects. At the same time, the chip revolution is going crazy, and you can get chips. A lot of these are vintage chips, but you can still strip chips off old circuit boards. So here's an old circuit board from the, wow, this would be the mid-80s. It's a Motorola 151 synthesizer on a board. Probably an eval board of some kind. The Radio Shack era. You're going to find a lot of surplus parts still around from Radio Shack. Different types of circuit cards. Oh, eval. I forgot to mention about eval. A lot of times people would order eval parts from companies and then they've ended up never using them. So you end up with these whole kits of evaluation parts and like whole boxes of transistors of different kinds. And they're basically full of transistors. They'll be sitting there at a Hamfest or something, and you can pick something like this up for $5. It's full of parts. So, of course, we're always looking for inductors for our transistor and our solid-state IC projects, and toroids and so on. So, anyway, there are a lot of parts that you're going to find in the solid-state realm. Much easier to get the solid-state parts than it is the older tube parts. But I wanted to bring solid-state in just to let you know you can still build vintage solid-state if you'd like to get into that stuff as well. Retro QRP. So let's get into some ethics now. There are certain pieces of equipment that were considered fair game. That is, their only role was to be taken apart and parted out. And for many, many years, the surplus glut from World War II and somewhat from Korea was considered to be fair game to part out. Certain pieces had a lot of value directly to the shortwave listener or to the ham radio operator, but other pieces were considered to be obsolete even during the war. One such piece, the BC 191 375 General Electric transmitter and its plethora of tuning units. Now this is considered to be one of the worst designs of World War II. It was the main transmitter in the B-17, B-24 Liberator, and many others. And it was a kind of an early 30s type design, master oscillator power amplifier with two gigantic triodes, 211s. Now those 211s were thrown away because they had no use. Of course the audiophiles now would die to have them, but they were all crushed, guys. Even the hams didn't want to use those old triodes. Anyway, these tuning units, each transmitter had a set of 5 or 6 of them. It had a beautiful switch here that could be used to switch legal limit power. It had this beautiful velvet vernier dial that was very useful. Inside it had some nice variable capacitors and some different types of tapped inductors with all ceramic construction. These were parted out probably by the hundreds of thousands, and the parts were sold and resold and used in projects through the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. So you're not going to believe it, these things are beginning to be scarce, and their value has gone from 0 up to perhaps $100 for a pristine tuning unit, just a tuning unit. So let's keep our hands off those. Also, the ARC-V SCR 274 type receivers and transmitters, they were used in ham stations, but they were also parted out en masse, and thousands of them were simply turned into piles of junk box parts. I think it's time to stop that practice altogether. These are becoming just too hard to find in pristine condition. Now, the ones that have been modified, I could say that perhaps you would take a couple bad ones, put it together to make a good transmitter or a good receiver. But just remember, these are becoming very rare now, and you can see the prices are going up all the time on these. Let's keep our hands off. Here's an example of what happens when somebody decides they're going to part out something and don't really think about it. This is a stripped chassis, beautiful condition, of an MD7 modulator. Now, the MD7 modulator was considered to be very primitive and not useful to hams. So it really was just something that was set aside for years. Then suddenly people decided, hey, I would like to have one of those to complete my ARC-V station. And they become very rare. So when you see one in this shape where every part has been taken off, it's just a dirty shame. I wish I had this pristine condition MD7 instead of just an empty chassis. The other temptation is the obsolete ham equipment over here. So this is something I found on the junk pile for $2. It's a Heathkit Q multiplier. It's a $2 piece. It's just been cut off. I have no idea. Is it even complete inside? Look at that. It is complete. It's missing the tube and that's it. This is completely restorable. Why would you want to part something like this out when it can be restored? And finally, the full-blown ham equipment itself. HR10, DX40, Apache, Johnson transmitters, all types of ham gear. Let's not part that out anymore, guys. That stuff needs to be restored. So we can move into the commercial radio world. Now, as you know, the All-American 5 and all of the glorious radios of the 30s and 40s, cathedrals and so on, like this Tombstone radio up here, you've seen it. Yeah, let's try to restore that stuff, if it truly is a basket case, or it's just a chassis that's been damaged and it is not restorable. Yes, we can get parts off those, but for the most part, most radios are becoming collectible. It doesn't matter if they're a crazy fruity color or a strange Bakelite radio. That may even make it more collectible. So the message is, hands off, know what you're taking apart, make sure that it truly is junk before you put it in your junk box. So finally, I want to talk about the anti-junk box movement. The anti-junk box movement is for the more challenged individuals who do not like rummaging through the junk box to find a part, or forgetting where they put the part, in which junk box it resides, and so on. And these people are by nature organizational. So they want to put things in a place where they can find them. Of course, this is radical to some of us, but if you would like to be able to find something, you could mark them. You could put them in a box that has proper markings. There are endless amounts of drawer systems that you can mark, and as you collect the parts, you can put them in these drawers. Rather than having them all just presented or in a junk box, you can have all of the different values neatly marked in a drawer. Perhaps all your crystals cataloged. You could go as far as to have a computer program that would document all of your stock. Okay, now these are anti-junk box ideas, and we're not going to get into them because that would spoil the whole video. But I just want to let you know there are some radical ideas up there. Well, maybe I did go a little overboard with the junk box video, but if you really want to make old-time projects, you know, like this simple 6L6, 6AG7 transmitter, or a regen receiver, or a Simple X Super superhet, you got to collect the parts. You got to get your hands on the transformers. You're going to need some of the basic old-time parts, some of the variable capacitors, and so on. And my message is, keep your eye open. Don't be afraid to look under the bench. Don't be afraid to go down to the neighbor's yard sale and start collecting enough parts. You can take a lot of value out of that big bill of material we found out that is $200. If you want to take a significant amount off that bill of material, you need to come up with some of the critical parts for free.